We'll have to do it after. If you haven't completed your individual whispered Amidah, please continue davening. We join together for Kaddish Shalem, page 54. Agudat Achim Rabba, Be'alma Divrach Yutei Be'amlich Malchutei B'chayechon V'mechon V'chayel Chol B'Yisrael, Bagal Avisman Kari V'imru, Amen. Yishmei Rabba Mevarach Le'alam Alameil Maya. Yitbarach V'yishtabach V'yitbar V'yishmam V'naseh V'yitadar V'yitalev V'yitalash Meni V'yusha Brichu Le'elam Min Kol Berkatav V'shirata Tush B'chatav V'nechmata Damran Be'alma V'imru, Amen. Tidkabal Tzaltan Avadon D'chol Yisrael Kodam Avahoni V'shmaya V'imru, Amen. Yesh Lama Rabba Min Shmaya V'chayim Aleinu V'kol Yisrael V'imru, Amen. Oseh Shalom Mimramav Hu Yaseh Shalom Aleinu V'kol Yisrael V'imru, Amen. We rise for Aleinu, page 56. Aleinu l'shabeach Adon hakol latei gdula liotzer breshit shelo asanu kigoyei haratzon v'lo samanu krish b'chol gadama shelo sam chalkeinu kahem v'gor aleinu kechol hamonam v'anachnu korim v'mishtahavim Halkei nekavel lecha Adonai Eloheinu liro mehi rabbi verdezecha lehavrigu li min haaretz beha elilim V'nemar v'hayav Adonai l'melech al kol haaretz v'yamahu Yonai echad u'shmo echad. Kaddish Avelim, mourners Kaddish. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah Be'alma divra kirutei v'yamlich malchutei Chayechon v'yomechon v'chayei d'chol beit Yisrael V'agalau v'zman kari v'imru, Amen. Yehi shmei Rabbah mevarach le'alam alamei almaya Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitbar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh V'yitadar v'yitalev v'yitalal shmei d'kudesha brichu Leila min kol birchata v'shirata tush b'chata v'nechmata damiran be'alma v'imru, Amen. Yehi shlama rabba min shemaya v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru, Amen. Oseh shalom mimramav hu yaseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru, Amen. We'll close there, and I'll turn it back over for the next segment of our learning.
Next segment of our learning, I think without further ado, I'll invite Professor Burke to come up. I recommend doing it from this side of the beamer because the microphone is tuned a little louder so we can hear you. So I'll let you introduce the title of your talk and go for it. So.
Chag Sameach. When I give a lecture, I usually say, I assure the people that I will finish before Shavuos. Well, we are at Shavuos, and I will be as quickly as I possibly can. The title of the talk is supposed to be on Zionism, but there can be no discussion of Zionism without anti-Semitism. And so I begin with the origins of anti-Semitism. I'll bring it up into the modern period, tack it on to modern Zionism, bring it to the conflict with the Arabs, and, believe it or not, hopefully within 30 minutes, link it to what is happening on college campuses. So let me begin. Where does anti-Semitism begin? Where does the hostility to the Jews begin? The great first-century historian Josephus said, it all has to do with Egypt. It all began in Egypt. Now, not long ago, we observed the Seder, right? And what is the lesson of the Seder? God in his infinite mercy led the Hebrews out, right? All of these things, God heard the groaning of the slaves and led us out into the desert, gave us the Torah on Shavuos, and so on. You should know that there is an Egyptian counter-narrative, and a very important counter-narrative. It is that these Hebrews, God didn't let them out. We threw them out because they were lepers and because they were very, very negative towards our gods. They insulted our gods, they insulted our people, we couldn't stand them anymore, and we threw them out. The idea of the Hebrews, remember that term Jew would not be used at that period of time, the idea that the Hebrews were a misogynistic people, a people who really had only contempt for everybody that was not a Hebrew, these ideas will spread into Greco-Roman civilization and in a certain way into Christian civilization as well. Anti-Semitism, not correct, anti-Judaism will receive a fillip, of course, when the church engages with the emergence of Jesus and the church engages in competition for converts with the Jewish people or with the Hebrews. By this time they are known as the Jews. These are the basic teachings of contempt. Teaching number one, Judaism at the time of the appearance of Jesus was spiritually bankrupt. The Jews worshiped the letter of the law, not the spirit of the law. The story in the New Testament that makes that point is Jesus chasing the money changers out of the temple. Look at the Jews, the damn Jews, they're turning a buck right in the vicinity of the Holy of Holies. In reality, the Jews had to be turning a buck. People from all over the Roman Empire were coming. They were buying animals for sacrifice. They had to exchange their currency for the currency of Judea. That's why there were Jewish money exchanges in the vicinity of the temple. But the most important thing of all, that is the most important development in the history of anti-Semitism, even though it begins with anti-Judaism, is that we are guilty of the greatest crime that has ever been perpetrated on this planet. Homicide is murder, a terrible crime. Parricide, the killing of a parent, is worse than that. Regicide, the killing of a king, is worse than that. But we are, in Matthew and in John, in the New Testament, we are guilty of the greatest crime ever perpetrated in the history of humanity. We killed the Son of God. Nothing in the history of hostility to the Jews is as important to that. So, what I'm saying to you is that over the centuries, this will be exacerbated. The Crusades will drive a stake literally into the heart of the Jews. And of course, what takes place is the demonization, the dehumanization of the Jews throughout Europe. Jews with horns, Jews with tails, Jews with longer penises than other people have, Jews with, let us say, different sexual proclivities. All of this is going to appear in the medieval and in the late medieval period. I tell the students what I'm telling you. For an American audience, this should not be strange. After all, look what we have done to African Americans in our country. We enslaved them, we segregated them, and of course we developed a folklore about them. Again, the idea that their sexual proclivities are different from ours, their sexual organs are different from ours, that every black man wants to plant his penis in the vagina of a white woman and girl. All of this is all narishkeit, to use the old language, but it is, again, perception is reality, and large numbers of people believe it. This is not going to come to an end for African Americans. One will see a mitigation of our plight with the coming of the Enlightenment and, of course, the coming of the French Revolution. On September 27th of 1791, the French Revolutionary government was the first government on the continent of Europe to emancipate its Jewish population. Within 70 years, every Jewish community in Western and Central Europe would be emancipated. But counterintuitively, this did not lead to a diminution of hostility towards the Jews. Quite to the contrary. Probably because, as one historian put it, we were like a coiled spring. Allow us out, take us out of the ghetto, and what do you get? You get Jewish doctors and Jewish lawyers and Jewish scientists and a plethora of Nobel Prizes. I'll give you the best example. You don't know him. Yaffa, his wife, or let us say his sister-in-law, was someone that some of you know. But Harold Lown, a good friend of mine and a stalwart of this congregation, had a brother that won the Nobel Prize. He won it for peace, but he's also the inventor of the defibrillator, considered at one time to be the world's leading specialist on that terrible phenomenon known as sudden death. When people just drop dead, you do all the autopsies, and there's no clogging of the arteries, and so on. They lived in a shtetl, Utyan, in Lithuania. On the day they left, this was a fairly well-to-do family, the father really hired a rabbi to teach the boys Talmud. When they left Utyan in 1936, the rabbi came to the boys' house in Utyan in the shtetl and read and wrote into Bernard Lown's Talmud portfolio, if this boy perseveres in the study of Talmud, he will be one of the Gaonim, one of the geniuses of our generation. They leave Utyan, they go to the end of the world, Bangor, Maine and Lewiston, Maine. No more Talmud, no more rabbinical instruction, just one of the world's great cardiologists and a winner of the Nobel Prize. That's what enlightenment does for us. That's what a free and open society does for us. But the problem is going to be we go so far, so fast, that there are people that do not like it. They're not accustomed to Jewish success. And any discussion of anti-Semitism in the modern period has to factor in envy. Envy of Jewish success. The Jews become a middle class and an upper middle class community par excellence. The religious antipathy remains, there can be no doubt about that. The envy is there, and then there is something else. Again, I tell my students what I'm telling you. You cannot understand the late 19th and 20th century unless you understand the appeal of communism and the fear of communism. And the important fact to remember here is that while the overwhelming majority of Jews rejected communism, the vast preponderant majority of Jews rejected communism, the fact of the matter was a disproportionate number of the communists were Jews. Here's an old Soviet joke. Kamenev, who is Jewish, says to Trotsky, who is Jewish, who says to Zinoviev, who is Jewish, who says to Sverdlov, who is Jewish, let's kick Lenin out and we can have a minion. The fact of the matter was the overwhelming majority of Jews living in the Soviet Union, living in Russia before that period of time, were not communists. Communism with its atheism, with its attack upon private property. But a disproportionate number of Jews were members of the Communist Party. I don't want to bore you with statistics, I'll give you this one. 30 million Poles on the eve of the Second World War. Of the 30 million Poles, 3.5 million were Jews. Out of 30 million Poles, there were 50,000 members of the Communist Party. 50,000 communists among 30 million people. Half of the communists in Poland were men and women of Jewish extraction. The idea that Jews and communists go hand in hand is going to lead to a tremendous exacerbation of the anti-Semitic impulse. That's the origin of modern Zionism. The real turning point is going to come in what historians elegantly call a watershed year, 1881. That's the year of the pogroms, 1881, 1882. Everything changes. Some of you are in this room, most of you are in this room probably, because of what happened in 1881. From 1830 to 1880, 40,000 Jews left the Russian Empire. 1830 to 1880, 40,000 Jews left the Russian Empire. 1881 to 1914, 1,500,000 Jews leave the Russian Empire and come to the United States. In addition to that, probably 150,000 make their way to Palestine. In 1881 and 1882, the great debate is, in Russian, Kuda, where do we go? America ili Palestina? Some of the rabbis, some of the intellectuals, and some of the Balabatim in the community said, either you stay here or you go to Palestine. But Russian Jews voted with their feet for the United States of America. That's why we have this large Jewish community here. But Zionism was born here. Not here, but in Eastern Europe. Zionism was born as a response to the pogroms, the anti-Semitism. Remember, here I'll give you the two most famous anti-Semitic quotations from the period of the time. Anti-Semitism was used as a political weapon, both in Russia and in Germany, because, believe it or not, there's an inherent coherence and beauty to anti-Semitism. And the coherence and the beauty is, I'm not being sarcastic here, the coherence of anti-Semitism is that it explains multi-causal phenomena in a monocausal way. It explains multi-causal phenomena in a monocausal way. Why are we poor? The Jewish capitalists have made us poor. Why is there a revolution? Jewish communists did it. Why did we lose the First World War? The Dolchstoss. The Jews stabbed us in the back. The man who says this most effectively in our country at this period of time is Reverend Farrakhan. He uses anti-Semitism as a political weapon. In Germany, at the end of the 19th century, Die Juden sind unser Unglück. The Jews are our misfortune. In the Russian Empire, Bezhidov spasadu Syriu, beat the kikes and save Russia. An argument to stay away from the Russian revolutionary movement because, according to some people, it was a Jewish revolutionary movement. That's Zionism. That's the Zionism of Herzl. They either hate us here, they will assimilate us, or they will kill us. It is necessary to get out of here. This is modern Zionism, a reaction to anti-Semitism. You heard in the lectures, you heard in the talk earlier before we had the Mariv service, you know the religious things, the religious connotations, the religious impetus. The Torah says you go to Eretz Yisrael. The psalmist says in Babylonia, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, if I forget thee, let my right hand forget its cunning, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. We face east, all of those things. Individuals go there. That's a religious impulse to go. You're hard-pressed to argue it is Zionism, but it is a remembrance of the land, and as the rabbi had said earlier, a yearning to go back to the land. Modern Zionism says we can do it by ourselves. We do not have to wait for the Messiah or the Messianic age. We can take our history into our own hands. Herzl was not the first to say this. Moses Hess said it. There were all the people who said it in an earlier period of time. But this is a quintessential example of a time and a place and an occurrence coming together. When Hess said it in the early 1860s, German Jews were obsessed with a unified German state. But the time you get to the 1890s, there are pogroms in Russia, there is the Dreyfus Affair. The significance of the Dreyfus Affair, that affair that split France, that led to an enormous eruption of anti-Semitism, the fact that it happened in France, the country of liberté, égalité, and fraternité, the fact that it happened there led many Jews in Eastern Europe to argue, if it can happen in France, it can happen anywhere. We've got to go to the ancient homeland. We've got to go to Eretz Yisrael. German Jews would not buy into Zionism. You may ask the question, why was the first Zionist Congress held in Basel? Herzl wanted it in Berlin or in Munich. Liberal rabbis would not allow it to take place, because the tension is in Zionism. It's not only among religious Jews, should we go, are we allowed to go, and so on. It is the argument of more secular Jews, the argument in Germany, the argument in Great Britain, The argument in France, and for some people in the United States, an argument that in one form or another resonates down to the present day. If you talk about going to the ancient homeland, does it undermine our citizenship here? Will people look upon us as being people of dual loyalty? What the Reform movement said, America is our Zion, Washington, D.C. is our Jerusalem. On the left, the Reform. On the right, the Orthodox, by and large, only with the coming of the Messianic age. But Zionism will persevere. And in the United States, it will gain a great fillip, a great impetus, by virtue of the fact that probably the most famous and most prestigious Jew of the time, Justice Brandeis, endorsed Zionism. Brandeis said in a very famous statement, just to give the short part of it is, to be a Zionist is to be a good American. To be a good American is to be a Zionist. He made it legitimate. He made it kosher. Zionism did not have an impact on anti-Semitism in Europe, for the most part. In Poland in the interwar period, there were some people who said, yeah, these Jews are not loyal to Poland, they want to go home. That was not a major factor. This is not to deny Polish anti-Semitism. Polish anti-Semitism was based on religious antipathy, we were Christ killers, on envy and competition. Do you realize how blessed we are in this country? In a whole variety of ways. There is not that ferocious competition for jobs, for professions, university placements, for land. It doesn't exist in our country. It existed in Poland and other places against the background of endemic poverty. Zionism did not cause anti-Semitism. It does not. Nor did it cause anti-Semitism in our country as well. What happens, of course, is, again, the bad times come. For the first and only time in American history, in the interwar period I'm talking about, we find men and women of influence and affluence endorsing anti-Semitism. And that is, if you bought a Ford in the 1920s, drove the Ford off of the lot, opened up the dashboard or the glove compartment, you would have a copy of Henry Ford's Dearborn Independent. And the result is going to be, he serialized the most important anti-Semitic document in modern history. That's the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. That was a forgery, purporting to be the secret minutes of an underground international Jewish organization. That document was born in the bowels of the Okhrana, the Tsarist secret police in the early years of the 20th century, in an attempt to use anti-Semitism as a weapon against the revolutionary movement. So, Henry Ford, and then, of course, and I must tell you, it shocks me. It really did shock me. Because I was talking to the students last week, and I asked them, who is America's greatest hero before the Second World War? And I knew they weren't going to give me an answer. And I said, how many of you in a class of 35 had ever heard of Charles Lindbergh? Not one student out of 35. Union College is a good school. Not one student had ever heard of Charles Lindbergh. Well, if they didn't hear of Charles Lindbergh, they surely weren't going to hear or know much about Father Coughlin. I'll lighten this up for you. Father Coughlin spoke 7 o'clock every Sunday in the late 1930s from the Church of the Holy Flower in Detroit. What I mean by lightening up, I do a lot of speaking in the Detroit area. And where do the people take you? They take you to two places, non-Jewish places. One is the restaurant where Jimmy Hoffa was last seen alive. That's a tourist spot. And the other is the Church of the Holy Flower. Father Coughlin was the first radio priest. He spoke to millions of people about how the Jews were responsible for the Depression, Jews were responsible for communism, and so on. So this is really a difficult time. But anti-Zionism or Zionism does not really stimulate that. There are other reasons for it. Once again, Americans are looking for a cause of the Depression. Remember, anti-Semitism explains multi-causal phenomena in a monocausal way. Some religious antipathy, some envy of the Jews, and always, always that linkage with communism. It is there, and you cannot undermine it. You cannot really minimize it in any possible way. But let's go back a step. Herzl, reacting to this anti-Semitism of his time, begins to talk about the need to go to a Jewish state. He doesn't say where to go. Australia maybe, Argentina, Arizona, he says. East European Jews say, hey, Herzl, you want to go to Argentina? Go. Or in Yiddish, geh Gesundheit, right? But for those, of course, others, the argument East European Jews is there's only one place to go. But here's where the problem starts. Who joins the Zionist movement? Many people on the left join the Zionist movement. They are the ones that create Poalizion. They are the ones that create socialist Zionism. And their vision of a Jewish state is, when we get there, we're going to lock the rabbis up, trot them out when people die, when they get married, or when they get bar bat mitzvah, and that's all. We're going to create a Jewish state based upon socialist principles, which means atheistic principles. But then, almost simultaneously, will come the people that I made reference to in one of the talks. Zionism does not begin after the Holocaust. There is a Zionist movement even among some Orthodox rabbis in the 19th century. And those people get together at the end of the 19th and the early part of the 20th century, form what comes to be known as the Mizrahi movement, and they have a vision that's very different. When we get to Eretz Yisrael, we are going to build a state based upon halacha. You know what I'm talking about, how that resonates down to the present day. Should the buses run on Shabbat? Should the stores be open on Shabbat? Should El Al fly on Shabbat? Should the food offered by an Israeli government representation or government organization be kosher or not? Do you have to get married by a rabbi? And does it have to be an Orthodox rabbi? Who determines who is a Jew? These problems, these internal problems of Israel, are not born today. They have their origins in the competing visions. And with all of this, someone forgot about the other issue. You want to hear the dumbest statement ever made by a Zionist? He left the Zionist movement. That's Israel Zangwill, a good man. But in the beginning, he was a Zionist. Listen to this statement. The people without a land is going to the land without a people. What nourishkeit! When he said that, there were 500,000 Arabs in Palestine and less than 45,000 Jews. Zionism didn't think really clearly about the Arabs. It eventually began to do things, and Herzl himself. You want a good read? Read Herzl's Das Alte Neuland, The Old New Land. In The Old New Land, his only novel, Herzl has an interview with an Arab sheikh. And the Arab sheikh says, or is asked by the Jewish correspondent, presumably Herzl, what do you think about all these Jews coming to Palestine? And the Arab sheikh said, we love it. We really love it. Why do we love the Jews? Why do you love the Jews coming to Palestine? Because their ophthalmologists come and they cure our children of trachoma, the terrible eye disease of the Middle East. Their OBGYNs come. They make sure that our women and children do not die in childbirth. Their engineers come, they drain the swamps. They create businesses employing Arabs and Jews. Do you understand the fatal misassumption of Zionism? To put it in biblical terms, the Zionist movement believed that the Arabs would trade their birthright for a better and better tasting bowl of cereal. They thought, the Zionist movement thought, we'll make life better for the Arabs in Palestine and they will accept us. But in an age of ideology and an age of nationalism, the idea that the Arabs would give up the claim to their land, absolutely inconceivable. So what are the roots of this hostility? What are the roots of it? Item number one, it's a national conflict. Whose land is this? Is it Philistine? Is it Arab land? Or is it Eretz Yisrael? Is it Jewish land? And I tell you what I've said in many places, both sides have legitimate claims to the same piece of real estate. You cannot deny Arab claims to that piece of real estate. But we have our claims too. The genius of mainstream Zionism was to accept half of a loaf of bread. The Arabs would not accept that. They wanted the whole loaf of bread. What I'm trying to tell you is, very quickly as I can, You look on television, you see all the pundits talking, and everybody says it's very, very complicated, this whole issue over Palestine and Israel. In some ways it is complicated, but in some ways it's very, very simple. I will say to you in English, in 2024, what Arthur Rupen, a German Zionist, said in German in 1931, and what Moshe Dayan said in Hebrew in 1968. It gets right to the issue. What we can get from the Arabs we do not need. What we need from the Arabs we cannot get. The bottom line, for want of a better cliche, is the root of the conflict in the Middle East is the unwillingness of the bulk of the Islamic world to accept a Jewish state in even a truncated part of Palestine. I'll say it again. The root of the conflict is the unwillingness of the most of the Islamic world to accept the idea that the Jews have a right to even a small part of Palestine. If that changed, if it were not the case, we would be celebrating the 75th anniversary of a Palestinian state. There would not have been that cycle of wars, and there would not be a single Palestinian refugee. That's one issue. The other is, who are we in the eyes of Islam? We are Dhimmis. We are protected people. Our religion in the eyes of Islam is legitimate but inferior, as is indeed Christianity. We were given divinely revealed books, we and the Christians. We were. Islam accepts that. And then we screwed them up. We distorted them. What did the Christians do? They took a great scholar, they took a great rabbi, and they made him into the Son of God, a violation of monotheism. And what did we do? We resorted to anthropomorphisms. God is angry. God smites with his right hand. God's nostrils flare. These are giving human characteristics to God. For the Muslims, that's a violation of monotheism. The rabbinical answer historically has been, God has to talk to the people in a language that they understand. And then the social conflict. Don't minimize this, certainly in the first 20 to 30 years before the State of Israel, and even after the State of Israel. Take the hypothetical leap backward. You're my students, you're all Jewish, we're in the year 1900. You're all on the left. You're all Marxists. I'm your Marxist instructor. But we've managed to link Zionism with Marxism. That's Ber Borochov who did that. And I say to you, comrades, comes the revolution, we are going to free the most oppressed people in the world. And then I would turn to you and say, who are the most oppressed people in the world? And you would say, Jews. And you'd be wrong. Then you would say, black people. Zionism was always sympathetic to black people. Always sympathetic to the cause of the African Americans and Africans in Africa. No, I would say, comrades, who are the most oppressed people in the world? Women are the most oppressed people in the world. What did we men do to women? We turned them into baby makers, domestic slaves, and sexual slaves as well. Comes the revolution, comrades, we're going to free women, we're going to emancipate them. So what does it mean? The kibbutz is a creation of that thinking. The communal dining room, the communal home for the raising of children. But what? What else is there? The women dress like men. The women shovel the dung on the kibbutz or the moshav. The women carry weapons. And the men? The men hop from bed to bed. The men shave their beards. And in some of the first settlements, they make it a point of honor to raise pigs and eat pork, demonstrating their freedom from the old ways. The Arabs knew Jews. The Jewish women dressed like Arab women. They were secluded. The Jews wore beards. The Jews prayed all the time, but not these people. Keep in mind, probably as I am speaking to you, hundreds of Muslim women in Africa and hundreds of women in Egypt are having an operation performed on their clitoris on the grounds that the clitoris is the seat of female promiscuity. So here come these enlightened Jewish women, and in survey after survey, going on for decades, when Arabs living in Palestine were asked, what is it you find repugnant about the Jews? It's the way their women dress. It's the way they dress on the beach, the way they comport themselves. So there is a national conflict, a religious conflict, and so on. When it comes to anti-Semitism, again, Zionism was not an issue. The only time is the interwar period, as I told you. And the Jewish community is up against the wall. There's nobody, very few people are confronting it. For all of the talk that Hollywood was a Jewish geschäft, there is not a single film between 1920 and 1945 that criticizes anti-Semitism. Criticizing fascism and Nazism, but not anti-Semitism. The Holocaust comes and everything changes. Hollywood suddenly discovers that anti-Semitism is anti-American. 2 films appeared. One of them I'm sure you all heard of and maybe saw or have seen, and that is Gentleman's Agreement with Gregory Peck. But there's another film demonstrating that Hollywood has discovered that anti-Semitism is anti-American, and it shows you the limits of Hollywood. It's set in San Francisco. It's Crossfire. It's set in San Francisco, 1945, in the summer. Group of demobilized Marines. They come in, they see somebody standing at the bar, they find out he's a Jew, they taunt him, and they kill him. And Robert Young, the detective, another great actor, comes in, solves the case, and so on. You see the limits of Hollywood because in the original screenplay, the man that is killed standing at the bar is killed not because he's a Jew, but because he's a homosexual. Hollywood would not change that for another 50 years. We thought with this, with the Holocaust, 6 million dead Jews, the pictures in Life magazine, the pictures in Time, the Nuremberg trials, we thought we had seen the last of anti-Semitism. People who were sagacious understood that Plato was right, and you could paraphrase Plato. Plato said that only the dead have seen the last of war. Only dead Jews have seen the last of anti-Semitism. I don't mean to scare any of you, particularly the youngest person in the room. We will all live with anti-Semitism. Your great-grandchildren will live with anti-Semitism. The question is not whether it exists, it exists. Does it exist in a magnitude that inhibits our entrance into the American mainstream? You and I lived through the golden age of American Jewry. The post-World War II period is the greatest age in the history of the Jewish people, not only in our country, but probably in any country in the world. Is Dara Horn right when she says that the golden age is over? That's something to think about. What rocked us to our very core, of course, was October 7th. October 7th changed everything. The anti-Semites came out, they masqueraded their anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism, and what did you see on college campuses? Again, very quickly, it's a mix. The anti-Semites in the faculty, not many of them, but they were there. They come out. Anti-Semites from the neighborhoods, they come out. Some anti-Semitic students, they come out as well. But that's not the bulk of what happened. The bulk, of course, are those students who really don't know very much history, don't know the context, want to be on the bandwagon, and the adage is true, one picture is worth 1,000 words. Seeing the bombing in Gaza, come to the conclusion that the Jews, the Israelis, are doing something very, very terrible. And then we begin to hear the loaded words. What we learned as children is not true. It is simply not true. Even though our parents told us this, they usually said it to boys, not to girls, because the girls might give each other a rough time. Boys actually fought with each other. Remember, it seems like 1,000,000 years ago. Sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never harm me. That's a crock. Words can really harm. And the 2 words that began to harm us most, the most incendiary words in our time, genocide and apartheid. If a country is practicing genocide, it doesn't have the right to exist. If a country is practicing apartheid, it doesn't have the right to exist. So this was coming out. And again, it's not only faculty, it's not only students, it's administrators. Administrators showed in some cases a great deal of cowardice. Administrators are frightened by the faculty. No administrator, especially if he or she is on the make and wants another job, wants on the resume that he or she confronted the faculty. So you have things like that. The most courageous of them all was this man Ben Sass, who was the president of the University of Florida in Gainesville, who let the students know right away, you want to protest? That's fine. You cannot intimidate, you cannot assault, and you cannot take over property, nor can you desecrate property. If you do that, you will be expelled from the institution. And Florida schools have remained, for the most part, quiet. In my own institution, it was a question, I think, of cowardice on the one hand, afraid of faculty, and also perhaps that the president of the institution shared some of the so-called progressive ideas. Some of you may know the story. It really became quite famous for a certain period of time. I even got my 4 minutes of glory in international news. After October 7th, Chabad said that some of the students at Union were frightened. Chabad asked me to give a lecture. That was October 7th. The lecture was given October 17th. Between that time, a young woman posted on the media that all of those who attended the Chabad bingo rally for Israel are guaranteed a place in hell. Students got upset about that. This young woman showed up at the lecture. In a million years, I never expected her to show up at a Chabad lecture. We got into a brief dialogue, and I ended the dialogue by saying, do you believe that people who attend a pro-Israeli rally should burn in hell? And she said, I do. Alumni got upset, donors got upset. Some of the stuff that you're reading in the newspaper may be a consequence of that. Then on November 6th of 2023, the president sent out a letter to everybody affiliated with the college. He condemned anti-Semitism and then foolishly, or maybe with conscience, maybe he really thought it was the right thing to do, he said, we do not condone the behavior of the student, and we do not condone the behavior of a member of the faculty, meaning me. In other words, he put me on the same level as the student in that particular case. Things have gone, they're quiet now, but it still resonates within the college. So the question here is, we are confronting something that we never anticipated. I am a Russian and Soviet historian by training, and so I will ask the old Russian question, asked by Russian revolutionaries in the 19th and early 20th century. Что делать? What is to be done? What do you do? And the honest answer is, damned if I know. That's the honest answer. I suggest that there are things that we can do. We cannot tolerate any anti-Semitic or any ferocious anti-Israeli statements. What's a ferocious anti-Israeli statement? That the Israelis are carrying out genocide. That's nonsense. Israel is not an apartheid state. Comparing Israel to the Nazis, that's crossing the line, and we must oppose it. We have the right to demand from politicians, political leaders, or the so-called influencers that they stand fast in condemning anti-Semitism. If you have not caught my accent, you know I'm from the golden land of Brooklyn. Now, let me see. I have one doctor that's here. Anybody else? And we have two doctors that are here. And we have a dentist here, maybe a third doctor here. I'm going to tell you what you never learned in medical school. Never learned this in medical school, and I am right. If you come from Brooklyn, on chromosome 16, there's a gene that codes for the Democratic Party. It is impossible, absolutely impossible to vote Republican. Now that I've moved, I've spent the winter in Florida, I know when the plane flies over West Virginia, a mutation takes place in that gene on chromosome 16. But by and large, you do see the Jewish loyalty to the Democratic Party. I'm only lightening this up. Some of you may remember our beloved congregants, Marvin and Seal Garfinkel. You may remember them. It's 1980. Marvin calls me up. Now, Marvin was the yeshiva bacher. Marvin calls me up and says, hey, Steve, did you vote? I said, no, not yet, Marvin. I said, Marvin, who did you vote for? Now, there were three choices in 1980. Ronald Reagan, Jimmy Carter, and the man that I voted for, John Anderson, a good and decent man. So I said, Marvin, who did you vote for? Silence. Silence. I said, Marvin, you didn't. He said, I did. I said, Marvin, you voted for Reagan? He said, yes. Now remember, he's a yeshiva bocher. And I said to him, Marvin, how did it feel to vote Republican? And the answer he gave me, and I have to come from Brooklyn or the New York City area to understand this. I said, Marvin, how did it feel to vote Republican? It said, it was the first time, like when I went to Nathan's and ate a treif hot dog. It was like a bolt of lightning would strike me in the booth and strike me dead. So I only saying this to you. I voted for him. I regret voting for Barack Obama. It's disgraceful. With anti-Semitism appearing in the African American community, Barack Obama made one statement and has said nothing else. Nothing else. One of the things that we learned from an earlier period in dealing with anti-Semitism, you've got to combat anti-Semitism with men and women of influence and affluence. They have the cachet that the rest of us do not have. So that's one of the things that we have to do. I also have told people, and I think at the college, they got very upset at this, this is not a time for giving Jewish money to universities, to museums, to orchestras and symphonies. Every Jewish philanthropic dollar should go to Jewish causes, Jewish institutions, and to the state of Israel. Use the money. Money is a tool. We all know that. Use it for the safety of the Jewish people. Israel is the first and only Jewish state in 2,000 years, and it lives in a state of siege. It is paying a heavy price for October 7th and what comes after that. And finally, let's talk tachlis to our younger people and to everybody out there. We live in a marketplace of ideas. That's a cliche expression, but it is true. We've got to combat those pernicious ideas. The Palestinians were offered a state 3 times. Once in the Peel Partition Plan of 1937, they rejected it. The second time on November 29th of 1947, when the United Nations General Assembly passed Resolution 181, partitioning Palestine west of the River Jordan into a Jewish state and an Arab state. Here you see the Zionist movement, including Menachem Begin, the revisionist who believed in a Jewish state on both sides of the Jordan, was prepared to accept half of the loaf of bread. On the other side, it's all ours. And then Barak, others, again, men, Israeli prime ministers have offered a Palestinian state. Again, I come back to what I said to you before. Underneath it all is an unwillingness to accept the idea that the Jews have a right to a state in Palestine. And you know what? To steal our own backbone, remember what Israel has meant to us. Does the country have flaws? Did it make mistakes? Of course it did. But what does it mean to us? It is the ultimate place of refuge for our people. That was the bottom line for Herzlian Zionism. Every Jewish man, woman, and child, regardless of mental or physical condition, can come into the state of Israel. Accomplishment number 2, it's Silicon Valley East. And it's not only the Pentium chip. Israeli agriculture, Israeli medicine enlightens the world and benefits the world. And number 3, the existence of a Jewish state, I'll use the elegant language, gives us for the first time in 2,000 years agency. We can determine our future to a certain extent. I'll juxtapose 2 dates for you. One, early May 1943. 300 Orthodox rabbis go to the White House to plead with Franklin Delano Roosevelt to somehow alleviate the plight of Jews in German-occupied Europe. They never get to meet Roosevelt. Never. They get nothing from Roosevelt. Then, with the Garfinkels, my wife and I, we're having a tuna fish sandwich at Hogan's on Regent Street. Hogan's is still there. It's July 4th, 1976. And the waiter comes over. Did you see on television what happened? Israeli soldiers landed at the Entebbe airport and rescued Jewish captives. That's what a Jewish state means. There is now a state that makes saving Jews a priority. That has never existed in history, not even in our own country. Again, forgive me for being the professor of history. There's an asymmetry at work in the history of the Holocaust. It's not that the whole world hated us and that's why we died. It's that there were many people that liked us and supported us, but they never made saving the Jews a priority. The asymmetry exists on the other side. If, God forbid, Adolf Hitler's spirit entered into there, came through, I said, Mein Herr, mein Führer, what was the primary aim of the Third Reich? He said it was to make Europe Judenrein clean of Jews. And that, to a very large extent, he succeeded. That was our problem. For those who wanted to save Jews, it came low down on a priority list. For those who wanted to kill us, it was probably one of the 3 war aims of the Third Reich. So, and finally, of course, this is a country under siege. The coldest of peaces exists. Israel has a peace agreement with Egypt. Heaven help an Egyptian doctor who went to a medical conference in Israel and then returns to Cairo. He's lucky if he remains alive. He'll be blacklisted. Israel has a peace agreement with Jordan. Heaven help a Jordanian writer or journalist who comes to an academic conference in Israel. Again, he'll be lucky to be alive or he will be blacklisted. The country is in a state of siege. And yet, again using the elegant language, Israel is far closer to Athens than it is to Sparta. It is the only democracy in the Middle East. 1 hour in the Knesset, with all that yelling and screaming and shouting and sometimes physical violence, you know that this is a raw but real democracy. So, we got to tell our people that. There's no guarantee that this will tell the tale, but we can't be afraid. We've got to really show some courage in dealing with this contemporary situation. We've been through worse before. We will get through this. Because I'm a Holocaust historian, I go to a woman. I refer to a woman that many people do not know, one of our real heroines. This was Rosa Rabota. Rosa Rabota, a young Polish woman from the left-wing Zionist movement, Hashomer Hatzair. She worked in a factory in Auschwitz. She, with a number of other women, smuggled the Schwarzpulver, the black powder, to the Sonderkommandos in Crematorium 5. They blew up the crematorium. The only time that this ever happened, in all of the extermination camps. The only revolt in Auschwitz is the Jewish revolt of October 7th, 1944. They horribly tortured her. Horribly. A guy from the underground gets in there. He wants to know, Rosa, did you name any names? And she said no. What she said to him, what she yelled out when they put the noose around her neck in the early part of 1945 is what I'm saying to you. Chamatz v'amatz. Be strong and be of good courage. In the end, yeh tov, both for us and for Israel. Are there any questions?
I'll follow up question, which is, so it seems that there's this academic ecosystem of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, where, you get published and you cite references and then scholars say, Lord colonialism is the lens to understand Israel. And, Israel, of course, has all the hallmarks of a modified definition of apartheid that you kind of twist it around. But, you get all, and so, is there really this ecosystem? And what do we do about it?
All right, look, I hope you heard what he said. He's absolutely right. There is that ecosystem. It is very difficult to deal with. You have to oppose it, again, in that community of ideas. You have to lay out what the truth is. But I suspect for this generation of faculty, it will be of no avail. But nonetheless, you've got to stand fast on this. Fortunately, how can I say this, knowing where I am? Deborah Lipstadt had it right. Deborah Lipstadt is really the outstanding student of anti-Semitism. Did you ever see the film Denial? It is something to see how she confronted this guy, David Irving, who denied the Holocaust. In an interview with Bret Stephens in the New York Times, she is always good with a quip. She said, you know, because a person has a PhD, he can also be an SOB. And that's part of the problem that we confront. I can't give you a panacea, I really can't. But it is necessary to stand up. Fortunately, the American people do not buy into this. Some younger people do. But every public opinion poll does show that the American people do support Israel. And what some of the commentators are, either they know it or they don't know it, but they're refusing to say it. Whatever you may think about the war in Gaza, most Israelis want the war to continue. And I think with good reason. Now, I don't have a monopoly on the truth. I really don't. If Hamas remains in Gaza, and everybody talks about the day after, who's going to come into Gaza and run Gaza if Hamas is still there? Who's going to invest in Gaza if Hamas is still there? I understand all the difficulties. I understand the casualties. But let me tell you, here again, forgive me for being the professor of history. Did you see the Times article on D-Day, a whole series of articles? President Macron of France went to the town of St. Cloud. On June 6th of 1944, RAF planes bombed St. Cloud, killing 1,500 French men, women, and children. He did not condemn the British or the Americans for that. He said there was a German contingent in St. Cloud, and it had to be attacked, regardless of the casualties. General Eisenhower, before D-Day, was informed by American intelligence that the American and British Air Forces have to destroy the railroad lines and the depots and the railroad stations in France to prevent the Germans from bringing up reinforcements to the beach. He was also told that that would lead to the killing of 40,000 French civilians. Churchill was reluctant to do it. Churchill was a Francophile. He didn't want to do it. We have a letter from Roosevelt to Churchill saying that, in effect, this is horrible, but if it saves the lives of Allied soldiers, then you do it. When you deal with an enemy who embeds himself in civilians, and that enemy has to be destroyed, then you do it. It's easy for me to say this. I'm not the one that's dropping the bombs. I'm not the one that's calling the shots. It's easy for me to say that. Nor, fortunately for me, do I have any hostages that are still there. If I did, I might think things a little bit differently. But I'm telling you, this is the arithmetic of war. This is the way wars are won. When you confront an enemy that embeds itself among civilians, and that enemy has to be rooted out, you don't deliberately target civilians. That's a violation of humanity. But if you're a man or woman, your hostages are there, you go get them, no matter what the price may be. Again, I tell you, I don't have a monopoly on the truth. You may think differently about this. But if I were an American soldier, if I were the American parent of an American soldier, and an American soldier was somewhere and we could get him out, but it would mean the deaths of a large number of civilians, I would argue for it. That's exactly what was done in the Second World War, again and again and again. You know what a Third Army Memorial is? That's Patton's army. A Third Army Memorial are the towns and villages in Germany that were leveled to ashes because German soldiers were firing from those buildings and we just blew them to smithereens. I hesitate to end on such a bloody note, but this is a difficult time. And we've got to say certain things. Again, I don't have a monopoly on the truth. You want to talk to me, you want to call me up and speak to me now. I know it's late, but I'd be delighted to talk with you. It is not the easiest issue to deal with, and I'm the first to admit that. Anybody else want to say anything? Chag Sameach, and thank you.
Chag Sameach. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. I think we're Yeah.